Good morning. If you have a Bible with you, we are going to be in John chapter 15. So I encourage you and invite you to find a Bible and join me there. Caden, you moved. Congratulations, man. Big stuff. Big weekend for Caden, if you didn't know. He won, well, not he alone, but district championship for the South Shelby football boys, woo woo, on Friday night. And capped that off with baptism. So good weekend. Congratulations to these fellers as well as North Shelby for winning their district championship. Pretty cool stuff. John chapter 15 is where we'll be. Rebecca and I, my wife, bought our first home from an older couple who were top-notch, like flower gardeners. The front yard in this home was pretty straightforward. It was just kind of like an organized mix of shrubs planted around in front of the house, and then two flower beds that they had built with those landscape blocks in the front around a couple trees. It was very low maintenance, very easy to take care of. The backyard, however, was a completely different story. This older couple had planted flowers absolutely everywhere. And so around the patio, down a sidewalk, behind the garage, where they had built this huge water feature with plants and flowers all around it. They had two raised bed flower gardens, then a really large flower garden in the back with a she shed. I mean, there's just flowers absolutely everywhere. The problem was this older couple, once we bought their house, they moved across the street, catty corner, to another house. Yeah, hopefully some of you are already seeing a problem. And that was that anytime we did yard work, they always happened to be walking by, right? Just one of those deals. One day, we bought the house in October, and so we didn't really get to see like the flowers and all their glory. And so one day, we were doing like fall yard cleanup, and we decided to just kind of like rip out pretty much everything that they had planted. And in some of the flower beds, there were like those little ornamental things that flowers grow on, like wagon wheels and bird baths and an old wood stove. And then one of the items was this old hand plow. And attached to this old hand plow was like vines everywhere. And it was next to the back door. And it was annoying and in the way. And so I grabbed a hold of the hand plow and just ripped everything with it. A couple days later, I ran into the lady who we had purchased the home from, and she said, "You know that was clematis." What? And she said, "Those vines that you're ripping out of your backyard, that was clematis. It's beautiful in the spring and summer, and you ruined it." It's like, oh, well, I looked up what a clematis was after that, or asked around, and it is a really beautiful, bright, vibrant, viney flower. And because I had ripped all of that out, it grew back kind of the next spring, but it was never the same. And the reason it was never the same is because I removed the structure on which it was growing. And even though it grew back, the plant was never full of life anymore, and it never looked like it once did. Jesus shares a story in John chapter 15 that is pretty similar, but before we jump into it, I want to review where we've been the past three weeks and of course what we've learned. Our series is about hurry, and over this time we've determined that most of us have a hurry problem. We rush from one thing to the next. We're constantly busy. Our schedules are overloaded. But Jesus invites us into a different life. And it's based off this idea of his yoke. He says this in Matthew 11, where he says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Read the last line with me. "For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." And it sounds like a wonderful life. It sounds great to live a life of ease, where our burdens are lighter, where we are less stressed and less anxious and less in a hurry. Over the last couple of weeks, we've realized that because of this invitation of Jesus, he extends some solutions to our problem hurry, or our hurry problem, I should say. And those solutions are silence, solitude, simplicity, which is what we talked about last week. Today we're going to look at another solution that Jesus throws out there, and it's the idea of structure. Doesn't that sound thrilling? Rules, framework. I want to let you know before we even get rolling here, these rules of life that Jesus is offering us, they're not as burdensome as most of the rules that we've applied ourselves. I grew up down the street from this guy named Jason. And just so you know, I've changed his name to protect his identity, so don't go stalking my Facebook friends trying to figure out who he was. But Jason was a turd, and I don't know how else to define him. Let me explain to you a few things that I regularly witnessed Jason do or experienced myself. One thing that Jason regularly did is he often swung at and sometimes hit our neighbor's dog with a baseball bat. And yeah, exactly, turd, I told you. And because of this, the dog grew extremely aggressive towards young people, obviously. I watched Jason do that, and then other times I experienced Jason trying to pick fights with us neighborhood kids. And he would often do this by throwing balls or sticks or rocks at our feet while we were rollerblading or at the wheels of our bicycle. Sometimes Jason would come outside and he'd threaten to shoot us with his pellet gun while we played wiffle ball and basketball. Like I said, Jason was a turd. But somehow or another, Jason often convinced his parents that those were all self-defense based on the fact that the rest of us kids picked on him. And so oftentimes his dad would come outside and he'd get involved and he'd cuss us out for picking on his son. I went into Jason's house one day on a good day, and I soon realized it was a place where I didn't really want to be. And the reason is because it was dark, it was thick with smoke of some kind, it was filthy, there were alcohol bottles everywhere, there was trippy music playing loudly. Jason was likely the way he was because his life was missing something. And as parents and grandparents, we probably know what that something was. What was it? Structure, right? We understand that structure is vital in certain situations. Now, Jason is an extreme example of an unstructured life. But today I want to realistically look at some ways that you and I might need more structure in our lives. And so I want you to ask yourself a couple questions. First with this, are you a reactive person or a proactive person? Are you floating through life waiting for the rug to be ripped out from under you, or are you prepared to stand up to life no matter what happens? Would you consider yourself behind the wheel of your own life, or is it like you're riding in the passenger seat, kind of letting life take you wherever it wants to? Or maybe to sum up all those questions into one, I would ask this: does life happen to you or through you? If you want to take Jesus up on his invitation of rest and of lighter burdens, there are certain practices that I believe help, and setting a schedule or a structure is one of them. Now, when we hear that, immediately we think of some rigid, legalistic set of rules where there's no flexibility and no fun, but that's not what Jesus offers. Instead, he's offering us a schedule that frees us up to doing the things that really matter to us. If there is a main idea for today, it would be this one: add structure to your schedule, or your schedule will structure you. Let's look at John chapter 15 to see exactly what Jesus is talking about. We're going to read the first 8 verses of John 15. I encourage you to follow along. It says this: I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. He continues, he says, yes, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father. Now, the image of a vineyard and a gardener who takes care of it was an image that in Jesus' day and culture was just, it was automatic. They knew what a vineyard was. They knew how it operated. The whole process of growing grapes, though, is somewhat lost on us. Most of us didn't grow up in wine country. And maybe you have visited wineries, maybe you've gone to a vineyard, but there are some elements of a vineyard that Jesus mentions here that are super important to understanding what it looks like to adopt the kind of life that Jesus offers us. The first element is the vine. And basically he says this is the part of the plant that delivers life and energy to the rest of the plant. The vine is like the woody part of the grapevine. It's what we might call the trunk or the stalk. It's what grows out of the ground. And throughout the scriptures, the nation of Israel is often referred to as a vine. Here are a couple examples of that. In Psalm 80, it says, "You brought us from Egypt like a grapevine. You drove away the pagan nations and transplanted us into your land. You cleared the ground for us, and we took root and filled the land." And so over and over again, you see these words that have to do with growing grapes. In Isaiah chapter 5, we read this, "My beloved had a vineyard on a rich and fertile hill. He plowed the land, cleared its stones, and planted it with the best vines. The nation of Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of heaven's armies." And so vineyards were to Israel what fields of row crops are to us in northeast Missouri. Their vineyards were everywhere, just like our cornfields and bean fields are everywhere. They were familiar with them. They were necessary for their life and their culture. And so Jesus goes into explaining this vineyard, and he thinks that his original readers, at least, could assume some things about the vineyard. And the vine, he says, is what gathers energy and delivers it, and it does so through its roots. Look what he says at the beginning of verse 1. He says, "I am the true grapevine." And that word true there is basically Jesus saying that he is the genuine, sincere source of the kind of life that most of us would really want to have. A life of rest, a life of easiness, a life of lighter burdens. The second element of the vineyard we're introduced to is the gardener. You'll see that halfway through verse 1. He says, "My Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more." The gardener cuts away unwanted branches so that what's left is healthy and productive. We know this idea as pruning. Jesus describes it more in verse 6. Look what he says there. "Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned." The thing is, a healthy vineyard doesn't appear that magnificent. By show of hands, who has visited a winery? Yeah, I'm not sure I want to admit that, right? So when you go to a winery and it's not the right time of year, it doesn't really look like much, right? It's just these stalks growing out of the ground attached to some strings strung across these fields. That's pretty much it. The vines are often pruned back so much that they don't look significant. They don't look like they're doing anything, but that's because the gardener knows what he's doing. He knows that the vine's strength and life are in the roots. He knows that what's beneath the surface is more important. In fact, most of these productive vines are 15 to 40 years old, and they're just a couple feet tall. They look insignificant on the surface, but what's underneath matters more. So in Jesus' lesson, he says the Father is the gardener. God knows what to prune away from your life and what to keep. And Jesus says, the gardener refuses to keep dead, useless branches. Instead, he cuts them off, gathers them into a pile, and burns them. There's a third element of the vineyard that Jesus mentions, and it's the branches. This is new growth to a grapevine. Look what he says in verse 5. He says, "Yes, I am the vine. You are the branches." Again, it's this idea. Jesus is the vine. God is the gardener. We are the branches. But I want you to notice that the branches are never left to do their own thing. They're not supposed to grow all willy-nilly. They're not free range, right? They're not independent. They don't live by mottos like do your own thing or make your own way, or you can't tell me what to do because you're not my boss. They don't say any of those things because they're attached to the vine, which is where they get their energy and life. Instead, look what Jesus says repeatedly. Verse 4, he says at the beginning, remain in me, and I will remain in you. Look at verse 5, halfway through. He says, those who remain in me, and I in them will produce much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Look at verse 7. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want, and it will be granted. Again and again, Jesus is saying, remain in me, remain in me, remain in me. Other words we might use would be connected, right? We have to stay connected to Jesus. And all of this should make us ask an important question. What is a branch's purpose? What does a healthy branch do? Look at verse 4 again. At the end of it, he says, a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine. Look at verse 5, halfway through. He says, those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. Look at verse 7. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. Verse 8, when you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. And so the answer, what is a branch's purpose? The obvious answer is to produce fruit. Quick question. Have you ever been given one job and completely botched it? At our previous church, I was helping a guy named Kevin do some finish work around the church building. We had added a new addition, and so some things need to be finished up, like install door handles and trim around doors and windows and install light fixtures and that kind of thing. Kevin is a professional, and he has long done that sort of stuff for a living. And so when I volunteered to help him, I knew I was like way out of my league, but I thought, if he could at least tell me a few things to do, maybe I could take one thing off his very full plate. And so as we were getting stuff ready, he said, so, what do you want to do? What do you want your job to be? And I said, I don't care. I'm not good at any of this stuff. You just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And he said, do you know how to install door closers? And for the record, I didn't, but I thought to myself, how hard could that be? And so I said, if that's what you want me to do, then sure, I'll do it. And so I went and I retrieved the door closers. I got all the necessary tools, and I got to work. I opened the first package, and I laid out the instructions on the floor and immediately knew I was in trouble because everything was written in the metric system. Big problem, number one. And so I thought, okay, I'm somewhat smart. Surely I can figure this out. At least I got a calculator on my phone. And so I sat down, and for hours, it seemed, I pored over those instructions until finally, with my head hung low, I went back to Kevin and said, I have no idea what I'm doing. Guess what Kevin did? He laughed. He laughed at me, okay? No, he showed me how to do it by basically saying, hang with me, I'll show you how to do it, and then you can do the next one. When it comes to being a branch in the vine of Jesus, we have one job, and it's not what we often think it is. We often think that our one job is to produce good fruit, but the truth is that's not our job, that's our purpose. Our one job is to remain connected to the vine, simply to stay attached to Jesus. I want you to see a couple verses from Galatians. It says Ephesians, ignore that. Somebody made a mistake. It was me. But Galatians chapter 5, very popular verses say this: the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives. Read them with me. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In a nutshell, most of us are wanting to be those types of people. We want that good fruit to be evident in our lives, and we try really hard to make all of those things happen. But I want you to pay special attention to the beginning of that verse up there. Who makes that stuff happen? Right? The Holy Spirit produces that kind of fruit. The truth is, most of us are trying to be good people by our own willpower. But time and time again, we fail. Why? Because we're trying to force a job that is not ours. It is not your job to produce fruit. It is your job to stay connected to the vine so that Jesus will produce that kind of fruit in you. And so the question we should be asking throughout this whole passage is, as a branch, how do I remain in the vine? Are there things that we can be doing that will help us guard against being useless? Are there things that we can be doing that will guard against being cut off? How can we be the most fruitful? Well, there is another element of growing grapes that isn't really mentioned in John chapter 15. It's an element that all vineyards and all wine enthusiasts know is vital to the strength of the vine and the production of grapes. And it was in every single picture that we had up here this morning, and yet Jesus doesn't really mention it. And it's the thing that holds the grapes up. We might call this a trellis, right? A vine is at its best when there's a support on which it grows. And a trellis is the structure on which all good fruit is grown. It's a framework for your life, if you will. And so if this is the case for grapes, then what Jesus is saying in John chapter 15, it's the case for our lives too. There has to be a structure. There has to be a framework if you want to produce the best fruit. I think there are some suggestions, but I want to warn you, the 4 suggestions I'm going to give you in the next couple minutes, they're not flashy, they're not fun. In fact, they sound pretty boring, and they certainly aren't fast. Maybe you've heard of Stephen Covey. He's a very popular writer who wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he said this: we achieve inner peace when our schedule aligns with our values. I think he's on to something for everybody, but I think this is especially true for Christians. Following Jesus or being his apprentice and putting on his yoke is something that you do. It must be in and on your schedule or it will never happen. You know what's weird? I have never met a single Christian who accidentally became a Christian. Have you? I've never met someone who accidentally woke up on Thursday morning and decided that they were going to follow Jesus. Living life at Jesus' pace isn't something that you do by mistake. It's something that you do on purpose. And it necessitates arranging your life in such a way that you don't forget where your energy in life comes from. And that is by staying connected to the vine. And so my quick question for you today is, do you want structure? Do you want to build a trellis in your life that will allow you to be the most productive in the eyes of Jesus? If so, I got 4 recommendations for you today. And I told you, they are not flashy, they are not fun, and they are not fast. But here they are. First one is this: slow down your body to slow down your life. Who regularly drives a vehicle? Regular basis. Drivers up in the house? This suggestion is just really going to annoy you, but I have a few suggestions based on this idea in your vehicle. Perhaps this week, try driving the speed limit. Ugh, that's awful, isn't it? Try coming to complete stops at stop signs and stoplights. Try not passing the slow-moving vehicle in front of you. If you're going to lunch today in Paris or Shelbyville and you get behind a tractor, don't pass it. Follow it as long as it takes. Sounds miserable, doesn't it? And if that annoys you, let me offer you an even more annoying one, Lynette, and that is, try walking at a slower pace, all right? Most of us are in a hurry, and it's true with our feet, it's true with our vehicles, it's true with our life. We have to slow down our body if you want to slow down your life. Second, intentionally put yourself in situations where you're forced to wait. This is just boring as all get out. So here's my advice. If you have an event to go to this week, if you have a meeting to go to this week, if you pick up your kids at school, go there early and go there without your phone. Ugh. When you're at the grocery store, get in the longest line. And when you hear that, you think, why would anyone waste their time with that sort of arrangement in life? Reason? Because when we regularly deny ourselves from getting what we want when we want, then we will respond appropriately when someone else denies us what we want and when we want. And this is true of God. If there's something going on in your life that you regularly ask God for and it doesn't seem He's answering, perhaps it's because you've grown too impatient. And perhaps He is trying to teach a different lesson. When we force ourselves to wait, we become calmer people. We train ourselves to respond with kindness rather than out of anger, and it will make us more patient, both with ourselves and other people, and more importantly, with God. Third thing I encourage you to try is turn your smartphone into a dumb phone. Now, I am not going to pretend that there's a single one of us in this room who is going to completely ditch our phones, all right? I'm not planning on it, but we can tell our phones what to do. So one recommendation is don't allow push notifications. That includes everything: text messages, emails, social media notifications, YouTube notifications. Don't let your phone tell you when it's time to check it. You set a schedule for when you do those things. Whether it's email or text, phone calls, you don't have to be available 24/7. Let me say that again. You don't have to be available 24/7. Your phone ain't your boss. Now, I've heard others call this parenting your phone. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. It's a pretty cool concept. Parenting your phone means you get to tell when your phone, it's time to go to bed, you turn it off, and you also get to tell your phone when it's time to wake up. And you don't allow it to come out of its room until you're good and ready. Fourth recommendation, say no to multitasking. If you are the parent of an athlete, or maybe you're an athlete yourself, then you know that the first years of basketball are really rough. Lots of mistakes, lots of turnovers. And one of the most common blunders in the early years when kids are trying to wrap their minds around the game of basketball is that when a pass is coming their direction, they'll often try to make their next move before they actually have the ball in their hands. Right? And so the pass is coming their direction, and they're already thinking about dribbling or passing again or shooting before they ever have possession of the game. And more often than not, the ball's bounced off their feet and it goes out of bounds, creating a turnover. Every time that happens, you'll often hear a coach or a parent yell something to the effect of, "Catch the ball before you make a move." Anybody heard that before out on the court? Yeah, you have, right? It is easy to see that problem in someone else's game. It's not always easy to see it in our own. Some, if not all of us, have convinced ourselves that we are more than what we actually are. We've convinced ourselves that we have more power and control over our lives than we actually do. And so we multitask. We try to do as many things as quickly as possible. And we end up dividing ourselves and our attention so many times that we never have enough attention to actually give it to one thing. And so my advice to you is focus on one thing at a time. And all God's people said, yeah, right. Right? Psalm 46:10 is a really popular verse. Will you read it with me? Be still and know that I am God. Read it again. Be still and know that I am God. Now, you've probably heard that verse quoted, and a lot of people put it on their walls and all that kind of thing. That verse was originally written in the context of war. Okay, so the guy who wrote this song was in the middle of a battle, and he writes, "Be still and know that I am God." And of course, he's writing that by being inspired by God to write that, okay? And as I came to realize that this was in the context of war, it made me think, who in their right mind would think in the middle of battle that it would be wise to stop, to be still, right? To us, that makes absolutely no sense. It sounds more dangerous than it's worth. But unless, of course, you trust that God is in control, you can never actually live out this verse, right? The same is true in our own lives. Many of us are running around like someone's chasing us, and we're not even sure who or why. But in doing so, we're fighting a war, a battle of hurry. But it's time that we stop. It's time that we be still and trust that God really does have your life in control. You and I both know that we are never going to structure our lives around stopping unless we do it on purpose, unless we intentionally build a trellis, a schedule, a structure on which we slow down. The 4 recommendations that I gave you today: slow down your body to slow down your life, intentionally put yourself in situations where you have to wait, turn your smartphone into a dumb phone, say no to multitasking. All of those things sound ridiculous, don't they? But it's because we're addicted to hurry. I encourage you, build a trellis, slow down, structure your life around some sort of schedule where you're free to do the things that are most important to you. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, we thank you for this challenge, even though it sounds boring. It sounds lame. It sounds futile, because we're living in a very hurried world. And most of us have adapted to that, or adopted that process of hurry instead of adopting the process of slowing down. I pray this week, when we're in a hurry, that someone who loves us will call us out for it. I pray that we will bear that burden with other people, so that we can recognize that as many times as we get in a hurry, we're saying no to you. Instead of structuring our lives around slowing down, we're structuring our lives around speeding up. And God, that doesn't seem to be working for any of us. And so I pray each time this week we're in a hurry, that you will remind us that it's important to focus on one thing at a time. It's important to slow our bodies down. It's important to say no to certain things so that we can say yes to you. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.